Imagine a world where no rules exist for the rich, where one man can control an entire industry, where workers earn pennies while owners build palaces, where children labor in factories, where politicians are bought like groceries. That world existed in America just 150 years ago. We call it the Gilded Age, an era when a few men accumulated wealth beyond imagination, when inequality reached levels never seen before or since. But here is what most people do not understand. The Gilded Age did not just happen. Specific events created it. This is that dark story. Think about this for a moment. In the 1880s and 1890s, a handful of men controlled almost everything. One man owned 90% of all oil refining in America. Another man produced more steel than the entire nation of Britain. Railroad barons controlled every mile of track between major cities. They set prices however they wanted. They paid workers whatever they chose. They bribed politicians openly. They crushed anyone who challenged them. And it was all completely legal. No income tax existed. No laws against monopolies. No rules protecting workers. No limits on working hours, no safety requirements, no regulations on child labor. Nothing stopped ambitious men from doing whatever it took to get rich. If you could build a monopoly, you kept it. If you could pay workers pennies, you did. If you needed to bribe a senator, you just brought cash to his office. This was normal business practice. But this system did not always exist. America in 1860 was different. Wealth was spread more evenly. No one owned entire industries. The federal government was small and weak. Most people were farmers or small business owners. The economy was regional, not national. Everything changed in just 30 years. By 1890, America had transformed completely. A few dozen families controlled most of the wealth. Workers had almost nothing. The gap between rich and poor was enormous. How did this happen so fast? The answer begins on a spring day in Virginia in 1865, a day when a war ended and a new kind of American economy became possible. Everything that followed, all the fortunes, all the mansions, all the inequality, traces back to that moment. Let us start there, at the beginning, when the old America died and the Gilded Age was born. April 9, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee rode slowly toward the McLean House. His army of Northern Virginia was starving. Supplies had stopped arriving weeks ago. Men were deserting every night. Union forces surrounded him completely. There was no escape, no hope of victory. The war was lost. Lee knew it. Everyone knew it. Now came the hard part: surrender. Inside the house, General Ulysses S. Grant waited. He wore a simple uniform, muddy from travel. Lee arrived in full dress uniform with a ceremonial sword. The contrast was stark. Lee looked every inch the Southern gentleman. Grant looked like a working soldier. They shook hands. They talked briefly about old times. Both men had served in the Mexican War years before. Then they got to business. The surrender terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home. They would not be imprisoned. They would not be tried for treason. Officers could keep their sidearms. Men who owned horses could take them for spring planting. Grant wanted reconciliation, not revenge. Lee accepted. The war was over. 4 years of fighting had killed over 600,000 men. The South was devastated. Cities burned. Farms destroyed. The economy in ruins. Slavery was ending. The entire Southern way of life was collapsing. The news spread quickly through telegraph lines. In Washington, in New York, in Philadelphia, people celebrated. The Union had survived. The nation would remain whole. The great moral struggle over slavery had been won. Church bells rang. People gathered in streets. There was joy and relief. The war was finally over. But something else had happened during those 4 years. Something that most people did not notice at the time. Something that would matter more than anyone realized. The war had transformed the American economy in ways that made the Gilded Age possible. Before the war, America was a collection of regional economies. The North had factories. The South grew cotton. The West was mostly empty. Transportation between regions was slow and expensive. Each area operated somewhat independently. There was no truly national market. You could not easily ship goods from New York to California. You could not coordinate business operations across long distances. The country was too big and too disconnected. The war changed that completely. Both sides needed to move troops and supplies quickly over long distances. This required railroads, lots of them. The North especially built extensive rail networks. Tracks connected major cities. Branch lines reached smaller towns. Supply chains stretched hundreds of miles. By war's end, the North had over 20,000 miles of track. The infrastructure for a national economy existed. It had been built for war, but it would serve business just as well. The war also proved that large organizations could coordinate complex operations. Armies of hundreds of thousands of men moved together. They were supplied with food, ammunition, clothing, weapons. They fought in coordinated campaigns across multiple states simultaneously. This required logistics, planning, and management on scales previously unimaginable. Someone had to organize all of it. Someone had to make sure supplies arrived where needed. Someone had to coordinate movement of troops and equipment. Men who managed these operations learned valuable skills. They learned how to run large organizations. They learned how to coordinate activities across long distances. They learned how to solve complex logistical problems. After the war ended, these men returned to civilian life. They brought their skills with them. They would use those skills to build businesses on scales never before possible. The war had been a training ground for the industrial managers who would dominate the Gilded Age. The federal government had grown dramatically during the war. Before 1861, the government was small and weak. It did very little. Most governance happened at state and local levels. But the war required mobilizing millions of men. It required issuing bonds to raise money. It required printing currency. It required coordinating industrial production across the entire North. The government proved it could accomplish things previously considered impossible. It showed that large-scale organization was achievable. This had important implications. If government could coordinate a war effort involving millions of people, then surely businesses could coordinate operations on similar scales. The war proved that size and complexity were not barriers. With proper organization and management, you could run enormous operations efficiently. This lesson would not be forgotten by ambitious businessmen. The war had also created winners and losers on a massive scale. The South was destroyed completely. Its economy had collapsed. Its labor system ended with slavery's abolition. Its cities were burned. Its farms were ruined. Recovery would take generations. Meanwhile, the North emerged stronger than ever. Its factories had expanded to meet war demands. Its farms had prospered feeding the army. Its financial systems had grown sophisticated managing war bonds and currency. This created an enormous imbalance between regions. The South had nothing, no capital, no infrastructure, no functioning economy. The North had everything. Capital was concentrated in northern banks. Infrastructure existed in northern states. Markets were located in northern cities. This concentration would prove crucial for what came next. When businessmen looked for investment opportunities, for places to build factories, for markets to sell products, they looked north. The regional imbalance accelerated northern industrialization. The war had also eliminated political opposition to northern economic interests. Before the war, southern politicians had blocked many northern proposals. They opposed high tariffs, that protected northern factories. They blocked railroad subsidies. They prevented banking regulations favorable to northern industry. Southern representatives in Congress stopped these measures repeatedly. But during the war, Southern states seceded. Their representatives left Congress. With Southern opposition gone, Northern proposals passed easily. High tariffs were enacted. Railroad companies received land grants and subsidies. Banking laws favored Northern financial interests. By war's end, the federal government strongly supported Northern industrial development. And after the war, when Southern states returned to the Union, these policies were already established. Undoing them would be difficult. The political structure now favored industrialization and business growth. Abraham Lincoln's assassination 5 days after Lee's surrender shocked the nation. Lincoln had shown concern for both North and South. He talked about reconciliation, about binding up the nation's wounds, about healing the divisions. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was weaker, less able to resist the forces gathering momentum, less able to control what happened next. The assassination removed the one leader who might have tempered the transformation that was coming. The soldiers who fought were returning home. Hundreds of thousands of young men. They had spent years in the army. They were accustomed to hardship. They were trained in organization. They were looking for opportunities. Many had seen parts of the country they never would have visited otherwise. They had learned skills. They had made connections. They had discovered ambitions they never knew they had. Now they were going home to find their place in peacetime America, and crucially, they were returning to an economy with almost no regulations. Think about that. No income tax existed. No antitrust laws. No labor laws protecting workers. No safety requirements in factories. No restrictions on working hours. No limits on child labor. No environmental regulations. Nothing prevented ambitious men from pursuing wealth by any means necessary. If you wanted to pay workers pennies per hour, you could. If you wanted them working 12 hours daily, you did. If you wanted to hire children, that was allowed. There were no rules stopping you. The banking system had been reformed during the war. National banks now existed. Before the war, banking was chaotic. Hundreds of state banks issued their own currency. The system was confusing and unstable. During the war, the federal government created a national banking system. National banks issued standardized currency. Credit became easier to obtain for those with connections. The financial infrastructure for large-scale business operations was in place. Entrepreneurs with good ideas could find financing. The telegraph had spread rapidly during the war. Both armies used it for communication. By war's end, telegraph lines connected all major cities. News and information could travel instantly across the country. Stock prices, market conditions, business opportunities. Information that once took days or weeks to spread now arrived in minutes. This created advantages for those positioned to act quickly. If you knew about an opportunity before competitors, you could move first. Immigration was about to accelerate dramatically. The war had temporarily reduced the flow of people from Europe. Ships were scarce. The conflict made travel dangerous. But peace meant renewed immigration. Europe was overcrowded. Jobs were scarce. Political turmoil plagued many countries. America offered opportunities. Millions would soon arrive. They would need work. They would accept low wages. They would provide the labor force that industrial expansion would require. Without immigrant labor, the rapid industrialization would have been impossible. Technology was advancing rapidly. The war had driven innovation in manufacturing, transportation, and communication. New methods for producing steel, better designs for locomotives, more efficient factory machinery. These advances would continue in peacetime. They would create new industries and opportunities. Men who understood these technologies would have enormous advantages. Those who could implement new methods faster than competitors would dominate their industries. Perhaps most importantly, values were shifting. Before the war, making money through business was respectable but not glorified. Land ownership mattered more. Professional status as a doctor or lawyer was more prestigious than being a merchant. But the war had been expensive. It required mobilizing economic resources on unprecedented scales. Success had gone to those who could organize production and finance effectively. The men who supplied the army, who managed logistics, who coordinated production, they had helped win the war. They were heroes. That success could now be directed toward peacetime prosperity. Making money was not just acceptable. It was building the nation. Businessmen who created jobs and wealth were serving their country. This shift in values mattered enormously. It meant that ruthless business tactics would be celebrated rather than condemned. That accumulating vast wealth would be seen as patriotic rather than greedy. The cultural justification for the Gilded Age was being established. The stage was set completely. Infrastructure existed from the war. Political opposition had been eliminated. Regulations were absent. Labor would soon be abundant. Technology was advancing. Financial systems were modern. Information flowed quickly. And most crucially, the men who would build Gilded Age fortunes were watching, learning, preparing. They understood that something fundamental had changed, that opportunities existed that had never existed before, that the rules of American business had been rewritten. They just needed one more piece, one technology that would connect everything, that would create a truly national market, that would make coordination across vast distances possible, that would allow businesses to operate on scales never before imagined. That technology was already under construction. Two companies were racing from opposite coasts toward a meeting point in Utah. Within 4 years, it would be complete. And when it was, everything would change forever. The Civil War had ended. Over 600,000 men were dead. The South was destroyed. The Union had survived. Everyone focused on those facts, on the tragedy and the triumph, on slavery ending and the nation remaining whole. Those things mattered. They were important. But they were not the most important economic consequence. The most important consequence was this: the war had created the conditions where extreme wealth concentration became possible, where a few men could capture control of entire industries, where monopolies could form and persist, where fortunes could grow beyond anything previously imaginable. April 9, 1865. The day Lee surrendered at Appomattox. That was the day the Gilded Age truly began. Not when the first mansion was built, not when the first fortune was made, but on that spring day in Virginia when the old America died and a new America, an industrial America, an unregulated America, an America where wealth would concentrate in just a few hands, that America was born. Everything that followed traces back to that moment. The transcontinental railroad, the monopolies, the immigrant labor, the political corruption, the massive inequality. All of it became possible because of what the Civil War had changed. The foundation was laid. Now came the building, and the building would be spectacular, brutal, and transformative. Building a railroad across an entire continent seemed impossible. The distance was staggering. Over 700 miles from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. Through plains where no trees grew. Over mountains rising 10,000 feet high. Across deserts without water. The engineering challenges alone would have stopped most projects. The cost would be enormous. The time required would be years. Many people said it could not be done. They were wrong. But the economic opportunity was too massive to ignore. Whoever connected the coasts would control transportation for the entire western half of America. Every freight shipment, every passenger traveling between east and west, all mail delivery, everything moving across the country would flow through that line. The company that built it would set the rates. They would decide what got shipped and what did not. They would become incredibly wealthy. The potential profits were beyond calculation. Two companies took the challenge. The Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha. The Central Pacific would build eastward from Sacramento. They would meet somewhere in the middle. Nobody knew exactly where. The company that laid the most track would control the most territory, would earn the most subsidies, would have the most power. This created a race. Each company wanted to build as much as possible before they met. The federal government made it financially attractive. For every mile of track completed, the companies received land grants, sections of territory on either side of the route. Millions of acres total. The companies could sell this land to settlers. This would generate revenue before a single train ever ran, before a single passenger paid for a ticket, before any freight was shipped. The land grants alone made the project profitable. The government also provided loans, bonds that could finance construction, essentially free money. The companies borrowed from the federal government at low interest rates. They used that money to pay for materials and workers. The bonds would be repaid eventually from railroad revenue. But in the meantime, the companies had cash to build. Without these government subsidies, the transcontinental railroad would never have been built. The risk was too high. The cost was too great. Private investors would not have funded it alone. Construction began in 1863 during the Civil War. Progress was slow initially. Labor was scarce because men were fighting. Materials were expensive because factories were producing for the army. The technical challenges were daunting. Nobody had built anything on this scale before. But after 1865, when the war ended, momentum built rapidly. Workers returned from the army. Materials became available. Money flowed in from investors excited about the project. The Central Pacific faced the harder job immediately. They had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains right away. This required tunnels, 15 of them. The longest stretched over 600 feet through solid granite. Workers used black powder for blasting. Later they used nitroglycerin. The explosions were dangerous. Men died regularly. Progress measured in inches per day through the hardest rock. In winter, snow buried the work sites. Workers tunneled through snow to reach the rock they were tunneling through. It was brutal, dangerous work. The labor force was mostly Chinese. Thousands of men recruited from California. More brought from China specifically for this work. They were paid less than white workers, around $30 monthly. White workers earned $35 or $40 for the same work. The Chinese workers also worked longer hours. They took the most dangerous jobs, hanging from cliffs on ropes to clear paths, handling explosives, working through brutal winters at high altitude where temperatures dropped far below freezing. The conditions killed many. Avalanches buried entire work camps. Men sleeping in tents were crushed under tons of snow. Explosions went wrong. Nitroglycerin was unstable. Sometimes it detonated unexpectedly. Workers were blown apart. Men fell from cliffs while clearing paths. Disease spread through crowded quarters. Medical care was minimal. If you got sick or injured, you either recovered on your own or you died. Nobody kept exact records of Chinese deaths. Estimates suggest hundreds died, possibly over 1,000. Their bodies were sometimes shipped back to China. Often they were just buried where they fell. The Union Pacific had different challenges. The terrain was flatter. This made construction faster. But supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Everything had to be hauled to the construction site, rails weighing hundreds of pounds each, wooden ties, spikes, food for workers, equipment, tools, tents. All of it traveled by wagon from the nearest railroad terminus. As the line pushed westward, the supply lines grew longer. Coordination became more difficult. At peak construction, the Union Pacific employed over 10,000 men. Many were Irish immigrants, recent arrivals to America who needed work desperately. They were paid slightly better than the Chinese crews building from the west, around $35 to $40 monthly. Still very little. Barely enough to survive. The work was brutal. Laying track in summer heat that reached over 100 degrees. Working through winters with temperatures below zero. Living in temporary camps that moved forward as the line advanced. The Union Pacific also faced attacks. Native American tribes watched their lands being carved up without their consent. The railroad crossed hunting grounds. It disrupted buffalo migrations. It brought white settlers who would claim tribal lands. Some tribes fought back. Cheyenne and Sioux warriors raided work camps. They tore up sections of completed track. They attacked supply trains. The company hired guards, former soldiers who had fought in the Civil War. Skirmishes were common. Workers died in these conflicts. So did Native Americans defending their territory. The line was being built through territory that was not empty. It was being taken. Tribes that had lived there for generations were being displaced. Their way of life was being destroyed. The railroad made that destruction faster and more complete. Once the line was finished, settlers would pour in. The buffalo would be hunted to near extinction. The tribes would be forced onto reservations. All of this was happening while the railroad was being built. The human cost was enormous, but the companies did not care. Progress mattered. Profit mattered. The people being displaced did not matter. Both companies raced frantically. Federal subsidies were paid per mile of track. The more you built, the more you earned. This created incentive for speed over quality. Track was laid quickly, sometimes poorly. Bridges were hastily constructed. Some were barely stable. Grades were too steep. Curves were too sharp. Engineers knew the construction was substandard. But the goal was forward progress, not perfection. Repairs could come later. Right now, they needed to lay as many miles as possible before meeting the other company. The competition intensified as the companies approached each other. By early 1869, both were working at furious pace. Some days, the Union Pacific completed several miles. The Central Pacific, having finally crossed the mountains, now worked on flatter terrain. They accelerated their pace. Both companies were racing toward the meeting point. Congress eventually designated where they would join. Promontory Summit, Utah, north of the Great Salt Lake, May 10, 1869. Officials from both companies gathered at Promontory Summit. Leland Stanford represented the Central Pacific. Thomas Durant represented the Union Pacific. Workers stood nearby. They had built this railroad. They had done the actual labor. But they were just spectators now. The ceremony was for the executives and politicians. Photographers set up their equipment. Journalists took notes. Spectators who had traveled to witness history crowded around. The ceremony was brief but symbolic. A golden spike would connect the final rails. The last spike driven would complete the transcontinental connection. Stanford took the hammer first. He swung at the spike and missed completely. The crowd laughed. Durant tried next. He also missed. Eventually, workers drove the spike properly. They knew how to do this. They had driven thousands of spikes. Telegraph operators standing nearby sent a message. One word, done. It traveled instantly to both coasts. Celebrations erupted in cities across America. In New York, church bells rang. Cannons fired salutes. People gathered in streets. In San Francisco, the celebration was even larger. Parades filled the streets. Ships in the harbor blew their whistles. The whole city shut down for the day. Chicago celebrated. Philadelphia celebrated. Cities everywhere marked the moment. The nation was connected. East and West were joined. America felt whole in a way it never had before. The immediate impact was transportation. What had taken 6 months by wagon now took 6 days by train. Passengers could cross the country in relative comfort. They rode in actual passenger cars. They could sleep in berths. They could eat in dining cars. The journey was still long and sometimes uncomfortable. But compared to walking beside a wagon for 6 months, it was luxury. Freight could move efficiently too. Goods that were too expensive to ship by wagon could now go by rail. The cost per pound dropped dramatically. Mail delivery accelerated. Letters that took months now arrived in days. This alone transformed communication. Businesses could coordinate operations across the country. Families separated by distance could stay in touch. News traveled faster. The whole country felt smaller, more connected, more manageable. The vast distances that had separated East from West were not barriers anymore. You could actually travel between them. See both coasts. The nation became real in ways it had not been before. For business, the implications were enormous. A national market now existed. Goods produced in one region could reach another region quickly and cheaply. Cattle from western ranches could be shipped to eastern cities. The meat would still be fresh when it arrived. Manufactured goods from eastern factories could reach western settlers. Orders could be filled in days instead of months. This created opportunities for companies that could operate at scale. Local producers could not compete with firms shipping from wherever production was cheapest. The railroad also created demand for supporting industries. Steel for rails, hundreds of thousands of tons, lumber for ties, millions of wooden crosties were needed, coal for fuel. Trains burned enormous amounts of coal. Telegraph lines were strung along the tracks. Communication followed transportation. Stations were built every few miles. Towns sprouted around those stations. People settled near the railroad because that was where opportunity existed. Every aspect generated economic activity. The land granted to the companies was sold to settlers. The railroads advertised heavily in eastern cities and in Europe. They promised cheap land and opportunity. Thousands of families bought railroad land and moved west. They established farms. They built towns. They created markets for goods shipped by rail. The companies profited from selling land, then profited again from shipping goods to the settlers who bought that land. It was brilliantly designed to generate multiple revenue streams. Most importantly for what came next, the Transcontinental Railroad proved that massive infrastructure projects could succeed. That companies could coordinate operations across vast distances. That with enough capital and organization, seemingly impossible tasks became achievable. This lesson would shape everything that followed. If a railroad could cross a continent, what else was possible? What other industries could be organized on national scales? What other opportunities existed for men willing to think big? Cornelius Vanderbilt watched the completion closely. He was in his 70s. He had made his fortune in shipping. But he understood that rail was the future. Transportation was where power and profit lived. Whoever controlled movement of goods and people controlled the economy. The transcontinental line had just demonstrated how valuable that control could be. Vanderbilt had already been buying rail companies in the East. Small lines connecting cities. He was consolidating them into a network. Applying the same principle the transcontinental project demonstrated, but to shorter distances with higher traffic density. Andrew Carnegie was also paying close attention. He had worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He understood what the transcontinental project required. Massive amounts of steel rail, all wearing out constantly, needing replacement every few years. If you could produce steel efficiently, if you could control that supply, the railroad boom would make you wealthy. Carnegie was already planning his move into steel production. He saw the demand coming. He knew whoever could supply rails cheapest would dominate the market. John D. Rockefeller saw different opportunities. Railroads needed to ship freight. Oil producers needed trains to reach markets. If you could negotiate favorable rates, if you could make deals the railroad companies could not refuse, you could undercut competitors. Rockefeller was thinking about how to use transportation power to build his own oil empire. How to get rates so low that competitors could not match them. How to control distribution through controlling shipping. The Transcontinental Railroad had done more than connect coasts. It had demonstrated what was possible in the new American economy: large-scale operations, national reach, massive capital deployment, government support making risky projects profitable, immigrant labor working cheaply and dangerously, indigenous people displaced without compensation or concern. The Gilded Age formula was visible in that single project. All the elements that would define the era were present. Within a decade, track mileage would explode across America. The transcontinental line was just the beginning. Companies would race to build networks across every region. Multiple lines would cross the continent. Branch lines would connect every significant town. By 1890, America would have more railroad track than all of Europe combined. The expansion would be frantic, chaotic, and incredibly profitable for those who controlled it. The competition would be fierce. Railroad companies would fight for territory. They would cut rates to steal traffic from rivals. They would bribe politicians for favorable charters. They would form alliances, then break them. The battles would be brutal. Some companies would fail. Others would consolidate. Eventually, a few large systems would dominate, and the men who controlled those systems would become the richest in American history. The golden spike driven at Promontory Summit was more than a symbolic gesture. It was the starting gun for the Gilded Age, the moment when America's economic transformation became inevitable, when the conditions for extreme wealth concentration locked into place. The Civil War had created the opportunity. The transcontinental connection made it real, and the men who understood what it meant were already moving into position. Vanderbilt would soon control Eastern railroads completely. Carnegie would build his steel empire. Rockefeller would create his oil monopoly. All of them were learning from this moment. All of them saw what the Transcontinental Railroad proved. That scale mattered. That government support was available. That workers could be exploited. That competition could be eliminated. That monopoly was achievable. The lessons were clear. The Gilded Age was beginning, and it would be built on rails stretching from ocean to ocean. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing. Born in 1794 on Staten Island, his family was poor. His father operated a small ferry between Staten Island and Manhattan. The work was hard. The pay was minimal. Young Cornelius grew up watching his father struggle. He learned early that poverty was brutal, that you had to fight for everything, that nobody gave you anything. You took it or you went without. He quit school at age 11. Education seemed pointless when the family needed money. He worked on his father's ferry. He learned how boats operated, how tides and currents worked, how to navigate New York Harbor, how to deal with passengers, how to compete with other ferry operators. The harbor was crowded with small boats. Everyone competed for the same customers. You survived by being faster, cheaper, or more reliable than the others. By age 16, Vanderbilt had borrowed $100 from his mother, a huge sum for his family. He bought a small sailboat with that money, started his own ferry service. He was competing directly with established operators, men who had been running ferries for years. They did not take him seriously. A 16-year-old boy with one boat. What threat was he? They found out quickly. Vanderbilt undercut their prices. He charged less for the same trip. He worked longer hours, started earlier, finished later, ran his boat when others were resting. He provided better service, kept his boat cleaner, treated passengers politely. Within a year, he had customers, lots of them. People chose his ferry because it was cheaper and better. He repaid his mother's loan. He bought a second boat, then a third. The pattern was set early. Find a transportation market. Enter it with lower prices. Work harder than competitors. Provide better service. Drive competitors out of business. Once you controlled the route, raise prices. Then move to the next market. Repeat the process. It was brutal. It was effective. And it was completely legal. Nobody stopped him. Nobody could. Vanderbilt spent decades building a shipping empire. He moved from ferries to steamboats. Steamboats were faster than sailboats, more reliable, less dependent on wind and weather. He bought his first steamboat in the 1820s, started running routes on the Hudson River, New York to Albany. Other operators fought back. They cut prices. They tried to drive him out. Vanderbilt cut prices lower. He could survive on tiny profits longer than they could. Eventually, they gave up or went bankrupt. He expanded to coastal routes, New York to Boston, New York to Philadelphia. Each time the same pattern. Enter the market. Undercut prices. Outlast competitors. Raise prices once you controlled the route. By the 1840s, Vanderbilt was one of the wealthiest men in New York. Shipping had made him millions. But he was not satisfied. Millions were not enough. He wanted more. The California Gold Rush created new opportunities. In 1849, thousands of people wanted to reach California quickly. The overland route was slow and dangerous. 6 months by wagon. Many died on the journey. The alternative was sailing around South America. That took even longer, over a year. Vanderbilt saw a third option. A route through Nicaragua, across the isthmus by river and lake, then by ship to California. Much faster than either alternative. He established the route in 1851, built facilities in Nicaragua, hired local workers, negotiated with the Nicaraguan government, started running passengers. The route was successful, profitable. For several years, most California-bound travelers used Vanderbilt's Nicaragua route. He made millions, but eventually the route became less important. The demand for California travel declined as the gold rush ended. Vanderbilt sold his interests and looked for new opportunities. By the late 1860s, he was in his 70s. Most men that age were retired, enjoying their wealth. Vanderbilt was just getting started on his biggest venture. He had watched railroads growing. He understood what they meant. Transportation was being revolutionized. Ships were still important, but trains were faster. They could reach anywhere tracks went. They were not limited to waterways. Whoever controlled rail networks would control commerce. Shipping would become secondary. The Commodore, as everyone called him now, began buying rail companies. Small lines connecting New York to nearby cities. The New York and Harlem Railroad. The Hudson River Railroad. He was not building new track initially. He was buying existing operations, taking control of lines others had built. This was cheaper and faster than construction. The lines already had passengers, already had freight traffic, already generated revenue. The consolidation strategy was brilliant. Individual small lines were vulnerable. They competed against each other for the same traffic. They had limited reach. They charged inconsistent rates. Passengers traveling long distances had to use multiple companies. change trains, buy separate tickets. It was inefficient and annoying. But connected into a network, these same lines became powerful. A passenger could travel from New York to Buffalo on Vanderbilt controlled track the entire way. One ticket, no transfers, consistent service. Freight benefited even more from consolidation. Shipping goods long distances using multiple railroad companies was complicated. Each company had different rates, different schedules, different standards for handling cargo. Goods had to be transferred between trains. This took time and increased damage risk. But with one company controlling the entire route, shipping became simple. One rate, one schedule. No transfers. Businesses preferred this. They would pay for the convenience. Vanderbilt replaced management at companies he acquired. He installed his own people, men he trusted, men who understood his methods. He standardized operations across his network. Same procedures, same quality standards, same customer service approach. This made the entire system more efficient. Costs dropped. Profits increased. The network became worth more than the sum of individual lines. He negotiated exclusive deals with connecting lines. If another railroad wanted to interchange traffic with Vanderbilt's network, they had to give favorable terms. Otherwise, Vanderbilt would route traffic through a different connection. This gave him leverage. He used it ruthlessly. Other railroads had no choice. Connect with Vanderbilt on his terms or lose access to New York traffic entirely. The tactics were often questionable. He would buy stock in a competitor quietly, accumulate a significant position, then manipulate the market to drive down the stock price. He would spread rumors, bad financial news, problems with the railroad. Sometimes the rumors were true. Often they were exaggerated or completely false. But they drove the price down. Once the company was weakened financially, Vanderbilt would offer to buy it, usually cheap. Management often had no choice. Sell to Vanderbilt or face bankruptcy. Most sold. He also bribed politicians systematically. This was not unusual. Most businessmen did it. But Vanderbilt operated at scale. He needed favorable legislation, charters for his companies, permission to consolidate lines, approval for rate increases, blocking of competing proposals. That required buying state legislators and city officials. He did so without hesitation. One of his most famous moves involved the New York legislature. In 1868, lawmakers were considering a bill that would harm his interests. The bill would have forced his railroads to reduce rates, to allow competitors access to his tracks. Vanderbilt could not allow that. He went to Albany, the state capital, with a suitcase of cash. He reportedly spent over $1 million bribing legislators. The exact amount was never confirmed, but everyone knew money changed hands. Lots of it. The bill failed. Vanderbilt won. His competitors were outraged. They complained publicly. They accused him of corrupting the legislature. Vanderbilt did not care. He had won. That was what mattered. Whether the methods were ethical was irrelevant. Business was war. You destroyed enemies or they destroyed you. Morality did not enter into it. Results were all that counted. By 1870, Vanderbilt controlled the New York Central Railroad. This was the key line connecting New York City to the Great Lakes, to Buffalo, to Cleveland, to Chicago eventually. Virtually all freight moving between the eastern seaboard and the Midwest traveled this route. There were no good alternatives. Vanderbilt set the rates. If you wanted to ship goods, you paid what he demanded. If you refused, your goods did not move. It was that simple. The profits were staggering. The New York Central alone generated millions of dollars annually. Vanderbilt owned the majority of stock. The dividends flowed directly to him. He had spent decades accumulating wealth through shipping. Now, in his 70s, he was accumulating wealth even faster through railroads. His fortune was growing at a rate that shocked even other wealthy men. But the Commodore was not content with just controlling one network. He wanted more. Always more. He began expanding aggressively, buying lines that connected to the New York Central, building new stations, upgrading track, replacing old rails with heavier steel rails that could handle more traffic. He envisioned a system that would dominate the entire Northeast, from New York to Chicago, from Boston to St. Louis, all under his control. The competition tried fighting back. Other wealthy men controlled their own railroad lines. They formed alliances to oppose Vanderbilt. They cut rates to steal his traffic. They bribed legislators too, trying to block his expansion. The battles were fierce. Millions of dollars were spent on both sides. Stock prices swung wildly as each side maneuvered. Newspapers covered the railroad wars extensively. Everyone wanted to know who would win. Vanderbilt usually won. He had more resources, more experience, more ruthlessness. He would wait for competitors to exhaust themselves financially. Then he would strike. Buy their stock when prices crashed. Take control of their lines. Add them to his network. One by one, competitors fell. Some merged with Vanderbilt voluntarily. Others were forced out. A few survived independently but diminished. The Commodore's empire kept growing. His methods became the template others would follow. Buy or destroy competitors. Consolidate operations. Control politicians. Set prices as high as the market would bear. Eliminate any obstacle to profit. It was monopoly capitalism in its purest form. And in the 1870s, with almost no regulation, it was entirely legal. No laws prevented railroad consolidation. No rules stopped bribery. No regulations limited rates. If you could build a monopoly, you could keep it. The Commodore's personality matched his business tactics perfectly. He was crude, blunt, often profane. He did not pretend to be refined or cultured. He had grown up poor. He never forgot it. Never tried to hide his origins. He viewed business as warfare. You destroyed enemies completely, or they would destroy you eventually. Mercy was weakness. Hesitation was failure. You acted decisively and brutally. That was how you won. His personal life was complicated and often unhappy. He married twice, had 13 children total. He favored one son, William, over all the others. William seemed to understand business, seemed capable of managing the fortune. The other children were disappointments to Vanderbilt. He thought they were weak, foolish, incapable. He fought with them constantly. Some of his children challenged him in court, sued him over money, tried to get larger shares of his wealth. He responded by cutting them out of his will entirely. Family loyalty mattered less than business success to Vanderbilt. He believed weakness should not be rewarded, even if that weakness appeared in his own children. Only William seemed worthy of inheriting the empire. Only William had proven himself capable. So William would get almost everything. The others would get minimal amounts. Enough to live comfortably, but not enough to waste. Vanderbilt was ruthless even with his own family. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January 1877, his fortune was estimated at over $100 million. In an era when skilled workers earned perhaps $500 annually, this was an incomprehensible sum. It was the largest American fortune to that point in history. No one had ever accumulated so much wealth. Adjusted for the economy's size at that time, it would be equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. One man, one lifetime, $100 million. He left most of it to William, not divided among his children, not distributed to charity, not given to public institutions. Almost the entire fortune went to one son. This concentration was intentional. Vanderbilt believed dividing wealth weakened it. Better to keep it concentrated in capable hands. Let it continue growing. Build a dynasty that would last generations. William understood this. He accepted the responsibility. William Vanderbilt proved even better at multiplying the fortune than his father had been. He expanded the railroad network further. He improved efficiency throughout the system. He raised rates wherever possible. He fought off competitors just as ruthlessly as his father had. Within a decade of inheriting, William had doubled the fortune. The family that had started with nothing, with a borrowed $100, now controlled the largest fortune in America. But the Commodore's real legacy was not the money itself. It was the model he created. He demonstrated conclusively that extreme wealth concentration was possible in America, that you could start with nothing and die controlling a vital industry, that aggressive tactics, political corruption, and monopoly power could build fortunes beyond imagination, that there were essentially no limits to how wealthy one person could become. Other men were watching closely. Andrew Carnegie saw how consolidation worked, how controlling every step of an industry created unbeatable advantages. John D. Rockefeller observed the political manipulation, how buying legislators made impossible things possible. J.P. Morgan noted how controlling a vital resource let you set whatever prices you wanted. They were all learning from the Commodore's example, all preparing to apply his methods to their own industries. Vanderbilt had also shown that America's lack of regulation created unique opportunities. In Europe, governments constrained monopolies more actively. They chartered companies with strict terms. They regulated rates to prevent gouging. They protected competitors from being destroyed. America did none of that. If you could build a monopoly, you could keep it. The only limit was how much you could control, how ruthless you were willing to be. The Transcontinental Railroad had connected the coasts. That created the possibility of a national market. But Vanderbilt had shown how to profit from that connection. Control the routes, eliminate competition, set prices high, extract maximum profit from every transaction. The formula was proven. The Gilded Age was fully underway now, and the fortune the Commodore built would fund the mansions, the art collections, the social ambitions that would define the era. One man, starting with a borrowed $100, ending with $100 million. In doing so, he had shown an entire generation of ambitious men exactly how to build their own empires. The template existed. The methods were established. The lack of regulation was confirmed. Now came the race. Who could build the next great monopoly? Who would become the next Vanderbilt? The competition was about to intensify dramatically. September 18, 1873, a Thursday morning in New York City. The banking house of J. Cook and Company closed its doors. Workers arrived to find the building locked. A notice posted on the front entrance. The firm was suspending operations. It could not meet its obligations. It was bankrupt. The news spread through the financial district within minutes. Messengers ran from building to building. Telegraph operators sent word to other cities. By noon, everyone knew. J. Cook had failed. The shock was enormous. J. Cook and Company was one of America's largest and most respected banking firms. It had financed the Union during the Civil War. It had sold government bonds that paid for the Army. It had funded railroad construction across the northern states. Everyone assumed J. Cook was invincible. Too big to fail. Too well connected. Too important to the American economy. If J. Cook could collapse, anyone could collapse. Nothing was safe. Within hours, panic spread through Wall Street. Depositors rushed to other banks demanding their money. They did not care about explanations. They wanted cash. Now, before their bank failed too. Lines formed outside bank buildings. Hundreds of people waiting, pushing, shouting, desperate to get their savings out before it was too late. Banks tried to reassure customers, tried to explain they were sound. Nobody listened. Fear had taken over, Stock prices plummeted. Investors sold everything: railroads, manufacturing companies, mining operations. It did not matter what the business was. Sell. Get out. Turn stock into cash before it became worthless. The selling became a stampede. Prices dropped 10%, then 20%, then more. Fortunes evaporated in hours. Men who had been wealthy that morning were ruined by afternoon. The New York Stock Exchange tried to maintain order. They could not. On September 20th, 2 days after Jay Cooke failed, the exchange suspended trading, closed completely. For the first time in its history, 10 days. No trading allowed. The hope was that suspension would calm the panic, give people time to think rationally. It did not work. The panic only intensified. If the stock exchange had to close, things must be even worse than people thought. The Panic of 1873 had begun. It would trigger the longest depression in American history up to that point. 6 years of economic contraction. Businesses closing by the thousands. Unemployment soaring to levels never seen before. Poverty spreading. Suffering on a massive scale. For ordinary Americans, it was catastrophic. For workers and farmers and small business owners, it was devastating. But for men like Vanderbilt, Carnegie and Rockefeller, it was opportunity. The greatest opportunity of their lives. The panic started with railroads. That is important to understand. After the transcontinental line was completed in 1869, railroad fever had swept the country. Everyone wanted to build railroads. Everywhere. The Northern Pacific across the northern tier of states. Extensions of the Union Pacific, dozens of smaller regional lines, connecting every town and city. Railroads to everywhere. The enthusiasm was boundless. The optimism was extreme. The construction required massive amounts of capital. More capital than actually existed in the American economy. So companies borrowed. They issued bonds. They promised investors huge returns, 8% annually, 10%, sometimes more, and for a while it worked. Money flowed in from investors, from banks, from Europe. Everyone wanted railroad bonds. They seemed safe. They paid good returns. Track got laid. Towns appeared along the routes. The expansion seemed limitless and permanent. But many of these railroad lines went nowhere profitable. They crossed empty territory, connected towns that barely existed, passed through regions with almost no economic activity. They were built on pure speculation, on the assumption that settlers would follow, that businesses would develop, that traffic would materialize eventually. Often, it did not. The railroads ran through beautiful empty country, barely carrying any passengers, hauling minimal freight, generating almost no revenue. Jay Cooke's firm had invested heavily in the Northern Pacific Railroad. This line was being built across Dakota Territory and Montana Territory, through some of the most spectacular scenery in America: mountains, forests, absolutely beautiful, also absolutely empty. Almost no people lived there. The construction costs were enormous. Building through mountains was expensive. Crossing rivers required bridges. The engineering challenges were constant. But the revenue was minimal. Almost no one wanted to ride this railroad. Almost no freight needed shipping. Jay Cooke kept lending money to the Northern Pacific. He assumed things would improve. Assumed settlers would arrive. Assumed the railroad would eventually become profitable. He was wrong. The railroad kept losing money, kept needing more capital. Cooke kept lending. He could not stop. If he stopped, the Northern Pacific would fail. If it failed, the bonds Cooke had sold would become worthless. Investors would lose everything. They would blame Cooke. So he kept lending, throwing good money after bad, hoping for a miracle. The miracle never came. Eventually, Jay Cooke's firm ran out of money. They could not continue lending to the Northern Pacific. They could not meet their own obligations. On September 18th, they closed. When that happened, the entire house of cards collapsed. Other railroad companies immediately defaulted on their bonds. If Jay Cooke could fail, their bonds were probably worthless too. Investors who had expected returns got nothing. Their investment disappeared. Banks that had lent money to these railroad companies could not collect. The railroads had no money. The bonds were worthless. The banks had counted on that money, had lent it to others, had promised depositors they could withdraw savings anytime. Now they could not pay. When depositors rushed to withdraw money, banks did not have it. They failed too. One after another, hundreds of banks across the country closed their doors permanently. Depositors who had trusted these banks lost their life savings, money they had worked years to accumulate. Gone. Completely gone. No deposit insurance existed. When a bank failed, depositors just lost everything. Families that had been financially stable fell into poverty instantly. Their savings vanished. The panic spread through the financial system like fire through dry grass. Uncontrollable and devastating. For the next 6 years, the American economy contracted severely. Construction stopped almost completely. No one was building new factories, no new railroads, no new homes. Why build when no one could buy? Factories that existed began closing. Without construction, there was no demand for manufactured goods. Without demand, factories had no reason to operate. They laid off workers, closed their doors. Entire industries shut down. Unemployment in some cities reached 25%. 1 worker in 4 had no job. In some industries, it was worse. Construction workers had almost no employment at all. Skilled workers who had made decent wages found no work anywhere. They exhausted their savings. They could not pay rent. They moved in with relatives or became homeless. Families that had been stable and respectable fell apart under the economic pressure. Soup kitchens opened in major cities. Churches and charitable organizations tried to feed the hungry. The lines stretched for blocks. Thousands of people waiting for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. This was their only meal of the day. Homeless encampments grew in parks and empty lots. Men built shelters from scrap wood and cardboard. Whole families living in crude structures without heat or sanitation. The suffering was visible everywhere. Labor unrest followed inevitably. In 1877, railroad workers struck when companies cut their wages. Again, the companies had cut wages multiple times already during the Depression. Workers had endured it. They had no choice. But another cut was too much. They refused to work. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 spread across the country. From West Virginia to California, thousands of workers walked off their jobs. Trains stopped running. In Pittsburgh, the situation turned violent. Railroad workers blocked the tracks. Militia was called in to clear them. The militiamen fired into the crowd of strikers. 20 people were killed, dozens wounded. The workers responded with rage. They burned railroad property, locomotives, cars, stations, buildings. The fires lit up the night sky. Federal troops were eventually called in to restore order. It was the closest America had come to class warfare since the Civil War. But while workers suffered and died and rioted, some businessmen thrived. The panic destroyed weak companies. That created bargains for strong ones. If you had cash when everyone else was desperate, you could buy assets for pennies on the dollar. Profitable businesses, valuable property, modern equipment, all available cheap because owners needed cash immediately. They would sell at huge discounts just to survive. Cornelius Vanderbilt expanded during the Depression. Railroad companies in financial trouble came to him. They needed money. He had it. He would buy their companies. Not for what they were worth. For whatever he chose to pay. They had no choice. Sell to Vanderbilt cheap or go bankrupt and get nothing. Most sold. He acquired railroad lines he had wanted for years. paid a fraction of their normal value. His network grew larger. His control became tighter. The panic that destroyed others made him wealthier. Andrew Carnegie saw opportunity in the chaos everywhere. Steel prices had collapsed. No one was building. Demand for steel had dropped to almost nothing. Struggling steel mills were desperate. They sold equipment at far below replacement cost. They sold entire facilities for less than the land was worth. Carnegie bought. He acquired the most modern steel-making technology. He brought in partners who had cash. He positioned himself perfectly for the recovery he knew would come eventually. His timing was brilliantly calculated. During depressions, construction stops, demand for steel falls, prices drop, weak producers fail. They cannot survive low prices. They close their mills, fire their workers, sell their assets. But depressions do not last forever. Eventually, the economy recovers. Construction resumes. Demand for steel returns. The companies positioned to supply that demand make enormous fortunes. Carnegie was positioning himself to be that company. He also kept his operations running during the Depression. While competitors closed mills and fired everyone, Carnegie kept producing steel. His costs were lower than anyone else. His technology was better. He could survive low prices longer than competitors could. He would sell steel at prices that lost him money temporarily. But it lost his competitors more money. They failed first. When they failed, Carnegie bought their assets, their facilities, their customers, their market share, everything. John D. Rockefeller used identical tactics in the oil industry. The panic hurt oil companies severely. Refineries closed. Drillers went bankrupt. Production dropped. Prices fell. Everyone was struggling. Except Rockefeller. His Standard Oil Company had accumulated cash reserves. He had been preparing for exactly this situation. When others were desperate, he would buy them. He offered to purchase struggling competitors. Most accepted gratefully. They had no choice. Sell to Rockefeller or collapse completely. Standard Oil's market share grew dramatically during the Depression. Companies that might have competed for decades were absorbed, gone, eliminated. By 1877, when the economy finally began recovering, Rockefeller controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. The Depression had given him a near-complete monopoly. The panic had done in 6 years what might have taken 30 years otherwise. It had concentrated the industry into his hands. The pattern repeated across every industry. Strong companies with capital reserves used the Depression to crush or acquire weaker competitors. The economic crisis accelerated the concentration of wealth and power. Industries that had been reasonably competitive became dominated by just a few large firms. In steel, Carnegie was dominant. In oil, Rockefeller was dominant. In railroads, a handful of men controlled everything. The Depression had winnowed the field. This concentration had enormous long-term effects. Once these men controlled their industries, they could set prices however they wanted. They faced minimal competition. They could extract maximum profit from every transaction, and those profits could be used to expand further, to enter new markets, to buy more competitors, to grow even larger. Success fed on itself. Power accumulated to those who already had power. The panic also taught these wealthy men crucial lessons about leverage and debt. Debt destroyed companies during economic downturns. If you had borrowed heavily and could not make payments, you failed. No matter how good your business was otherwise. If you could not pay your debts when they came due, you were finished. But if you had accumulated cash and stayed liquid, downturns became opportunities instead of threats. You could buy while others were forced to sell. Andrew Carnegie especially took this lesson to heart. He became obsessive about maintaining cash reserves, about avoiding debt. He would rather grow slowly with his own capital than borrow and grow faster. Debt created vulnerability. Cash created power. During the next panic, and Carnegie knew there would be another panic eventually, he wanted to be the buyer, not the seller. The strong company taking advantage, not the weak company being destroyed. For ordinary Americans, the Depression of the 1870s was complete disaster. Workers lost jobs, families lost homes, savings disappeared, children went hungry. The suffering was widespread and severe. Recovery was slow. Even when the economy began growing again around 1879, it took years for employment to return to previous levels. The scars lasted for a generation. Meanwhile, the industrialists who survived grew even wealthier. They had acquired assets cheap during the panic. Now those assets were valuable again. A factory bought for $50,000 during the Depression might be worth $200,000 during recovery. A railroad line purchased for pennies on the dollar now generated profits. The men who had cash during the crisis multiplied their fortunes during the recovery. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. Workers who had stable employment in 1873 lost everything during the Depression. They never fully recovered. They were working again by 1880. But they had lost their savings, lost their homes, started over with nothing. Meanwhile, Carnegie's fortune was growing into the tens of millions. Rockefeller was accumulating even more. Vanderbilt's heirs were building mansions. The inequality was becoming extreme. The political response was weak and inadequate. Some people called for government intervention, for regulation of railroads and banks, for protection of workers, for unemployment relief. But business interests blocked most reforms. Politicians who had been bought stayed bought. The few regulations that actually passed were weak, poorly enforced, easily circumvented. They accomplished almost nothing. By 1879, the economy was finally recovering. Construction resumed slowly. Factories reopened. Unemployment began falling. But the business landscape had changed fundamentally. More concentrated. More controlled by fewer people. The Depression had winnowed competitors. It had consolidated industries. It had left the strongest firms completely dominant. Carnegie emerged positioned to become the undisputed steel king. Rockefeller controlled oil refining. Vanderbilt's heirs dominated Eastern railroads. These were not just successful businesses anymore. They were monopolies, or very close to monopolies. And in an era with almost no antitrust enforcement, monopoly meant absolute power. Power to set prices. Power to set terms. Power to control entire industries. The Panic of 1873 is often remembered as catastrophe. And for millions of Americans, it absolutely was catastrophic. But for the men building Gilded Age fortunes, it was something else entirely. It was catalyst. It was accelerant. It cleared away competitors. It created bargains. It proved that wealth could grow even during depressions. Maybe especially during depressions. If you were positioned correctly, if you had resources, if you were ruthless enough to buy when others were desperate. The lesson was absolutely clear. Economic crisis did not have to hurt you. Not if you prepared properly. Not if you maintained cash. Not if you were willing to take advantage of others' suffering. The rich could get richer even while the poor got poorer. Crisis and opportunity were two sides of the same coin. It just depended on which side you were on. This dynamic would define the entire Gilded Age going forward. Inequality was not just a side effect of industrial growth. It was actively accelerated by each economic cycle. Booms created fortunes. Busts concentrated those fortunes further. And the complete lack of regulation meant nothing prevented this concentration from continuing indefinitely. The system was designed to transfer wealth upward. The Panic of 1873 proved it worked exactly as designed. By 1880, as the Depression finally ended completely, the shape of the American economy was set for the next 2 decades. A few men controlled key industries. They faced little effective competition. They had politicians in their pockets. They possessed more wealth than anyone had thought possible just 15 years earlier. The foundation was completely laid now. The consolidation was essentially complete. What came next would be even more dramatic. But the hard work of building monopolies was mostly done. Now came the display of wealth, the mansions, the parties, the social climbing. That story was about to begin. Two men, two industries, two completely different strategies, but the same result: unimaginable wealth and near total control. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller rose simultaneously in the 1870s and 1880s. They knew each other. They watched each other closely. They competed for the title of richest man in America. But they built their empires using opposite methods. Different paths to the same destination. Complete domination. Carnegie was visible and loud and social. He wrote articles for magazines. He gave speeches. He attended dinners and parties. He believed in something he called the gospel of wealth. The idea that rich men had a duty to give their money away before they died. To build libraries. To fund universities. To help the poor. He talked about this constantly. He was charming in person. People who met him often liked him immediately. His public persona was friendly and warm. But his business tactics were absolutely ruthless. Rockefeller was the complete opposite in personality. Quiet, private, deeply religious. He rarely gave interviews to newspapers. He avoided publicity whenever possible. He lived modestly despite his enormous wealth. His home was large but not ostentatious. Not a palace like the Vanderbilts built. He gave away money too. Enormous amounts of money. But he did it quietly, without seeking attention or praise. Where Carnegie courted public notice, Rockefeller actively shunned it. Their industries required different approaches. Steel was about production, about building mills that could produce more steel faster and cheaper than anyone else. Carnegie's advantage came from efficiency, from controlling every step of the process, from owning the iron ore mines, the coal mines, the ships that transported ore, the railroads that moved coal. Every step from raw materials to finished steel rail. This was called vertical integration. Oil was different. Oil was about control of distribution and refining. Rockefeller did not drill for oil himself. That was too risky. Oil wells were unpredictable. Some produced abundantly, others produced nothing. Drilling was gambling. Instead, Rockefeller controlled what happened after oil came out of the ground. He refined it into kerosene for lamps. He shipped it to markets. He sold it to customers. His advantage came from monopolizing these middle steps. This was called horizontal integration. Carnegie's rise started right after the Depression of 1873. He had worked for railroads earlier in his career. He understood exactly what they needed. Steel rails. Lots of them. The iron rails being used wore out quickly. Steel rails lasted much longer, were much stronger, could handle heavier trains. Every railroad in America would eventually need to replace iron with steel. The demand would be enormous. Whoever could supply steel rails cheapest would dominate the industry. The Bessemer process had been developed in the 1850s in England. It could produce steel faster and much cheaper than old methods. But the technology required scale to work efficiently. A small mill using the Bessemer process was not dramatically cheaper than traditional methods. The savings were minimal, but a huge mill running constantly at full capacity achieved costs no competitor could possibly match. The larger the mill, the lower the cost per ton of steel produced. Carnegie built huge mills around Pittsburgh. The Edgar Thomson Works was completed in 1875. It was the largest steel facility in America at that time, possibly the largest in the world. The mill ran constantly, 24 hours daily. Workers operated in shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 7 days weekly. No breaks, no holidays. The furnaces never cooled. The production never stopped. Steel poured out continuously. He drove his workers extremely hard. 12-hour shifts were brutal. The work was dangerous. Furnaces reached thousands of degrees. Molten steel splashed. Burns were common. Machinery crushed limbs. Men died in accidents regularly, several times each year. Carnegie paid relatively well compared to other industries, but he demanded maximum output, every minute, every hour. Workers who could not keep the pace were fired immediately, replaced with someone younger and stronger. His management philosophy was brutally simple: drive costs down relentlessly. Every penny saved per ton of steel multiplied across millions of tons became enormous profit. He measured everything obsessively. He knew his costs better than his competitors knew theirs. Down to the fraction of a cent. When rivals cut prices to steal his customers, Carnegie cut deeper. He could survive at prices that bankrupted others. He had lower costs, better technology, more efficient operations. But Carnegie's real advantage was vertical integration. The concept was simple but powerful. He did not just operate steel mills. He bought iron ore mines in Minnesota, rich deposits of high-quality ore. He bought coal mines in Pennsylvania. The coal fueled his furnaces. He bought ships to transport ore across the Great Lakes from Minnesota to Pittsburgh. He bought railroads to move coal from the mines to his mills. Every step that added cost to steel production, Carnegie brought inside his own company. This meant when iron ore prices rose in the market, Carnegie did not pay more. He mined his own ore. The price increase did not affect him. When shipping rates increased, Carnegie did not care. He owned his own ships. When railroad rates went up, it did not matter. He owned the railroads moving his materials. Competitors who depended on outside suppliers watched their costs rise steadily. Carnegie's costs stayed level, or even fell as his operations became more efficient. During good economic times, this meant higher profits for Carnegie. His costs were lower. His prices could be lower than competitors while still making more profit per ton. During bad times, it meant survival. When steel prices dropped during recessions, competitors with high costs failed. They could not survive low prices. Carnegie could. He kept operating, kept producing, kept selling. Even at prices that lost him money temporarily, he could outlast anyone. By 1885, Carnegie Steel was the largest steel producer in America. By 1890, it was producing more steel than all of Britain combined. An entire nation. Carnegie alone was out producing them. His fortune was accumulating at a staggering rate. Tens of millions of dollars initially, then hundreds of millions. He was becoming one of the wealthiest men in human history. John D. Rockefeller's path was completely different. He started with one oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio in 1870. Just one facility. The oil business at that time was completely chaotic. Thousands of small drillers competed. They drilled wells everywhere. Some found oil. Most did not. Prices fluctuated wildly. One month oil sold for high prices. The next month prices crashed. Refiners processed crude oil into kerosene for lighting lamps. But the refining business was fragmented. Hundreds of small refineries competed. Rockefeller saw opportunity in all this chaos. His insight was brilliantly simple. Do not compete on drilling. That is too risky. Compete on refining and distribution. Oil had to be refined to be useful. Crude oil straight from the ground was worthless. It had to be processed into kerosene. Whoever controlled refining controlled the entire industry. Rockefeller set out to control refining completely, to own it all. His tactic was brutal but effective. He negotiated secret deals with railroad companies. In exchange for shipping all his oil exclusively on their lines, he got lower rates than competitors. Much lower rates. sometimes half what others paid. This gave him an enormous advantage. He could undercut rivals on price significantly. He would sell kerosene below his actual cost in markets where competitors operated. His larger operation could absorb temporary losses. Smaller refiners could not. They either sold their refineries to Rockefeller or went bankrupt. When competitors agreed to sell, Rockefeller usually kept their refineries operating. He did not want to destroy production capacity. He wanted to own it, control it. The former owners often stayed on as managers, but they worked for Standard Oil now. They followed Rockefeller's rules. Their profits flowed to him. He was building a monopoly one acquisition at a time, absorbing every competitor, growing larger with each purchase. This approach was called horizontal integration. Instead of controlling the supply chain vertically like Carnegie, Rockefeller bought all the competitors at his level of the industry, all the refiners. Eventually, he controlled them all, or nearly all. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. It was not legally a monopoly, but functionally it absolutely was. If you needed kerosene, you bought from Rockefeller. There were almost no alternatives. The organizational structure was brilliant. Rockefeller created something called a trust. Separate companies in different states, technically independent, but all controlled by Standard Oil trustees, all following the same policies, all coordinated centrally. This structure let him operate nationally while avoiding state-level regulations. Each state could only regulate companies within its borders. But Rockefeller's companies in one state were connected to companies in other states. Regulators could not touch the whole organization. The trust structure also made the monopoly harder to attack legally. Prosecutors could not easily target one entity when power was distributed across dozens of technically independent firms. They would have to go after each company separately in each state. That would take years, cost enormous amounts. Most prosecutors gave up. Rockefeller's monopoly was protected by its own complexity. His management style emphasized total control and extreme efficiency. He hired the best managers available. He paid them very well, better than they could earn anywhere else. But he measured their results obsessively. Refineries that did not meet his standards were closed. Workers who did not perform perfectly were dismissed. Everything was optimized completely for maximum profit. Nothing was wasted. Every penny was accounted for. Rockefeller's personal life remained modest despite the massive wealth. He did not build a mansion like Vanderbilt. His home was comfortable but not excessive. He attended Baptist church regularly, every Sunday without fail. He taught Sunday school classes. He gave away 10% of his income from his very first job onward. As his wealth grew into millions, his charitable giving grew proportionally. He gave away millions annually, but always quietly, without publicity. But his business tactics were absolutely merciless. Competitors who refused to sell to him faced coordinated attacks. Rockefeller would cut prices dramatically in their specific markets while maintaining normal prices everywhere else. He would pressure railroads to raise shipping rates for his competitors. He would spread rumors about their financial stability. Most competitors eventually gave up, sold out, joined Standard Oil. The few who persisted usually failed eventually anyway. By 1885, both men had achieved what had seemed completely impossible just 20 years earlier. Carnegie was producing steel on a scale that dwarfed all American competitors combined. Rockefeller had created a monopoly that controlled the entire oil industry from refining through distribution. They were the two richest men in America. Their fortunes were still growing, accelerating even. Their personalities remained utterly different. Carnegie enjoyed his wealth openly. He built a large mansion in New York. He traveled to Scotland regularly. His family had immigrated from Scotland when he was young. He never forgot his roots. He hosted elaborate dinners. He talked philosophy with intellectuals. He wrote books and articles. He cultivated relationships with politicians and business leaders. He wanted to be liked, respected, admired. Rockefeller avoided all public attention. He let his managers deal with journalists and publicity. He focused entirely on business and religion. His social circle was small and carefully selected: close family, church members, a few trusted business associates. He did not pursue fame or status. He seemed genuinely uninterested in what people thought about him. Beyond his immediate family and church community, opinions did not matter to him. But both men shared crucial traits that made them successful: total dedication to their businesses, absolute willingness to destroy competitors without mercy, ability to think long-term and plan decades ahead, and most importantly, they operated in an era with essentially no regulation. They could do things that would become illegal decades later. Monopolies, price fixing, secret deals with railroads, crushing competitors through predatory pricing. All of it was legal in the 1880s. Neither man felt any guilt about their tactics. Carnegie argued that competition benefited society overall by driving efficiency. The strong companies survived because they served customers better, produced better products, charged lower prices. The weak companies failed because they deserved to fail. They were inefficient. They could not compete. This was natural selection applied to business. It was progress. It made America stronger. Rockefeller had a different justification, but reached the same conclusion. He believed he was bringing order to chaos. The early oil industry had been wasteful and unstable. Too many refiners. Constant price wars. Companies failing constantly. Standard Oil brought stability and predictability. Customers got consistent products at stable prices. That was good for everyone. Even if it eliminated competitors, even if it created a monopoly. The results justified the methods. Both men would face severe criticism later. Muckraking journalists would expose their tactics in detail. Politicians would call them robber barons, thieves, criminals. Trust-busting movements would target their monopolies specifically. Laws would eventually be passed trying to break up their companies. But in the 1880s, they were still building, still expanding, still accumulating. The criticism had not started yet. The political backlash had not formed. And the fortunes they were accumulating would eventually fund massive philanthropy. Carnegie's wealth would build over 500 public libraries across America and Britain, would fund universities, would endo foundations that still exist today. Rockefeller's giving would create modern medical research institutions, would fund public health campaigns, would establish universities. But that philanthropy came later, much later. First came the accumulation, the ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable accumulation of wealth on a scale America had never imagined possible. Two men, two industries, two completely different paths to the same destination. But together they demonstrated conclusively what was possible in post-Civil War America, with the right strategy, with the right timing, with complete absence of regulation. A single individual could control an entire industry, could accumulate more wealth than small nations possessed, could reshape the American economy according to their personal vision. The industrial foundation of the Gilded Age was now completely set. The monopolies were built. The fortunes were made. What came next would be the display, the mansions, the social climbing, the parties, the attempt to transform economic power into aristocratic legitimacy. That transformation was just beginning, but the hard work of building industrial empires was essentially complete. The Gilded Age fortunes were built on a foundation most people never saw: immigrants, millions of them, arriving from Europe desperate for work, willing to accept wages that native-born Americans refused, willing to endure conditions that no one should have to endure. Without this army of desperate labor, there would be no Gilded Age, no fortunes, no monopolies, no mansions on Fifth Avenue. The wealth existed only because of the people who could barely survive. Carnegie's steel mills needed workers, thousands of them. Rockefeller's refineries needed workers. The railroads needed workers. The factories needed workers. The mines needed workers. All of these industries required more labor than America's existing population could supply. The solution was immigration. Massive immigration on a scale never seen before. And that immigration solved the labor problem completely. The numbers tell the story clearly. Between 1870 and 1890, over 10 million immigrants arrived in the United States. 10 million people. Most came from Europe, from Germany and Ireland and Italy, from Poland and Sweden and Norway, from Russia and Hungary and Greece. They arrived poor. Nearly all of them. They had spent everything they owned just to pay for passage across the Atlantic. They needed work immediately. Today, this week, they had no savings, no resources, no time to be selective. This desperation created perfect conditions for employers. When workers have nowhere else to go, when they are competing against thousands of others for the same jobs, wages stay low. Very low. A steel worker in the 1880s might earn $12 for a 72-hour work week. That comes to about 17 cents per hour. Barely enough to survive. Certainly not enough to save anything. Not enough to send money to family back in Europe. Just barely enough to eat and pay rent for a tiny room. The conditions were brutal beyond description. Steel mills were hot and dangerous. Men worked near furnaces that reached thousands of degrees. The heat was overwhelming even 20 feet away. Right next to the furnace, it was unbearable. But that was where the work was. Workers handled molten metal. They poured it. They shaped it. They moved it. Accidents were common. Daily occurrences. Molten metal splashed onto skin. Burns covered arms and faces and hands. Machinery crushed limbs. Exhausted workers made mistakes that killed them. There was no workers' compensation, no insurance, no safety regulations of any kind. If you got hurt at work, you were fired. Immediately. You could not work anymore. You were useless to the company. Someone else would take your job within hours. If you died at work, your family got nothing. Not a penny. The company owed them nothing. Your body would be removed. Your position would be filled. Life would continue as if you had never existed. Coal mines were somehow even worse than steel mills. Deep underground. Poorly ventilated. Dark except for the small lamps miners carried. Always at risk of collapse or explosion. Miners worked in cramped spaces. On their knees. On their bellies. Breathing cold dust constantly. That dust destroyed their lungs slowly. Black lung disease killed miners years after they stopped working. A slow, painful death from damaged lungs that could not get enough air. Miners were paid by the ton of coal extracted, not by the hour. This created incentive to work faster, to take risks, to skip safety precautions. The faster you worked, the more coal you mined, the more money you earned. But working faster meant more accidents, more cave-ins, more injuries, more deaths. Miners knew this, but they had families to feed, children who needed food, rent that had to be paid. So they worked fast. They took risks. Many died. Cave-ins killed miners regularly. The tunnels were not properly supported. Companies cut costs by using minimal timber. The rock above was unstable. Sometimes it collapsed, buried workers alive, crushed them. Rescue was often impossible. The bodies were left buried. Explosions were even worse. Cold dust in the air could ignite. A spark from a tool. A flame from a lamp. Suddenly the entire mine was on fire. Dozens of men killed instantly. Dozens more trapped underground, dying slowly from smoke and gas. Children worked too, in factories especially. Factory jobs did not require strength. They required small fingers for detailed work. Quick hands that could move fast. Children as young as 8 or 9 years old worked in textile mills. They operated machines. They tied broken threads. They cleaned under dangerous equipment. They worked the same long hours as adults. 12 hours daily, sometimes 14, 6 days weekly, but they were paid a fraction of adult wages, half or less. Many children were injured by the machinery they operated. Fingers caught in gears, hands crushed by moving parts, small bodies pulled into machines. The injuries were horrible, sometimes fatal. It was cheaper for companies to hire a new child than to make factories safer. Safety equipment cost money. Training took time. Easier to just replace injured workers. Children and adults alike. The immigrants lived in conditions that shocked anyone who saw them. Tenement buildings in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, families crowded into single rooms. Not single apartments, single rooms. One room for an entire family. 6 people, 8 people, sometimes more. No running water inside the buildings. No indoor toilets. Outhouses in backyards. Garbage piled in streets because there was no organized collection. Disease spread rapidly through these neighborhoods. Tuberculosis killed thousands annually. Cholera outbreaks happened regularly. Typhoid was common. The death rate in immigrant neighborhoods was far higher than in wealthy areas. Children especially died young, before age 5, before age 10. Illness that rich children survived easily killed poor children, because they were already weak from poor nutrition, already sick from crowded conditions, already vulnerable. Multiple families often shared one small apartment. A bedroom would hold parents and children, all sleeping in one room. The living room would be rented to another family. They would sleep there. The kitchen might house a third family. Privacy did not exist. Personal space did not exist. The smell was overwhelming. Too many people. Too little ventilation. No way to bathe regularly. No way to wash clothes properly. But rent in these tenements was all immigrants could afford. Even this terrible housing took most of their wages. A small room might cost $4 or $5 monthly. When you earned $12 weekly, that was a huge portion of your income. Food took most of the rest. There was nothing left for savings, nothing left for emergencies, one illness, one injury, one lost job. Any of these meant complete disaster. The ethnic communities formed out of pure necessity. Irish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods. People clustered with others who spoke their language, who shared their religion, who understood their culture, who could help them navigate this new country that was so different from home. These communities provided support that American society did not offer. Churches and synagogues became centers of immigrant life. They offered far more than just religion. They provided social services of all kinds, help finding work, assistance with learning English, child care for mothers who had to work, food for struggling families. These institutions filled gaps that government completely ignored. Without them, immigrants would have been even more vulnerable than they already were. Employers deliberately exploited ethnic divisions. They hired workers from different groups intentionally, pitted them against each other. If Irish workers demanded higher wages, the company would bring in Italians willing to work cheaper. If Poles tried to organize a union, the company would hire Hungarians. The constant competition kept wages depressed. It prevented unified labor action. Workers could not cooperate when they were competing desperately for the same jobs. Language barriers made organization nearly impossible. A factory might employ workers speaking 10 different languages. They could not communicate effectively with each other. They could not coordinate demands. They could not plan strikes together. Employers preferred this confusion greatly. It prevented solidarity. It kept workers divided and weak. The work itself was often seasonal in nature. Construction happened in warm months only, spring through fall. Many workers had no jobs at all in winter. They had saved nothing. Wages were too low to save. They faced months of unemployment. Some returned to Europe during American winters, worked there if they could find anything. Others simply suffered, went hungry, relied on charity, hoped to survive until spring construction resumed. Women worked too, though their options were severely limited. Domestic service was the most common work. Young immigrant women became maids and cooks and laundresses in wealthy homes. The pay was terrible, $3 or $4 weekly. But it included room and board. They lived in the wealthy homes where they worked, usually in small rooms in the attic or basement. For a family struggling to feed everyone, having a daughter living elsewhere helped. One less mouth to feed. Many young women sent money home regularly to support parents, to help younger siblings, to bring other family members to America eventually. They lived on almost nothing themselves, saved every possible penny, sent it home. The sacrifice was enormous. Years of their lives spent serving wealthy families, earning barely anything, never seeing their own families. Garment factories employed thousands of immigrant women. Sewing work did not require English language skills. The tasks could be learned quickly. Pay was calculated per piece completed, not per hour worked. Fast workers earned barely enough to survive. Slow workers earned even less. The pressure was constant: work faster, produce more, earn enough to live. Women worked until their hands cramped, until their eyes could barely focus, until exhaustion made them sick. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 showed how dangerous these conditions were. Though this happened slightly after our main period, it revealed problems that existed throughout the Gilded Age. Workers were locked inside the factory during shifts. The company wanted to prevent theft. When fire broke out, workers could not escape. Doors were locked. Windows were too high. Fire escapes collapsed under the weight of fleeing workers. 146 people died. Most were young immigrant women, trapped, burned alive, or jumped to their deaths. Chinese immigrants on the West Coast faced additional severe discrimination. California specifically targeted them with laws designed to make their lives impossible. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country entirely. This was the first law ever that excluded an entire nationality from immigrating to America. Existing Chinese immigrants faced violence regularly. Forced relocation. Their property was stolen, their businesses destroyed. The message was brutally clear. Some immigrants were acceptable, others were not wanted at all. But despite all the hardship and suffering and discrimination, immigrants kept coming. Year after year, decade after decade. Because as terrible as conditions were in America, they were often better than what immigrants had left behind. Ireland had suffered devastating famine in the 1840s. The effects lasted for generations. Italy had poverty and political instability. Eastern Europe had pogroms against Jews, violence and persecution. Russia had economic collapse and political turmoil. For many people, America represented hope, even if the reality was grim. The children of immigrants often did slightly better than their parents. Not much better, but slightly. They learned English in public schools. They understood American culture. They could pursue opportunities their parents could not access. This mobility was real but very slow. Most second-generation immigrants still worked manual labor jobs. But some found their way into skilled trades. A very few became small business owners. The possibility existed, even if the probability was low. For the robber barons building Gilded Age fortunes, this labor pool was absolutely perfect. Abundant workers, desperate for any job, divided by language and ethnicity, willing to work for wages that made enormous profits possible. Carnegie's steel mills could not have operated profitably, paying American-born workers what they demanded. But with immigrant labor accepting much less, the profit margins were huge, enormous, almost unlimited. The industrialists did not see exploitation in any of this. They saw opportunity. They saw themselves as providing jobs to people who had none. Yes, the wages were low. Yes, the conditions were dangerous. But that was not their problem. Workers were free to quit if they did not like the terms. That was how the free market worked. Supply and demand. If workers would accept low wages, why pay more? That would be bad business, irrational, foolish. This attitude was widespread among wealthy Americans. Poverty was seen as personal failure, character weakness. If you were poor, you had not worked hard enough, had not been smart enough, had not saved properly. If conditions were bad at your job, find better employment. The idea that structural factors might trap people in poverty was rejected completely. Success or failure was individual responsibility, nothing more. Some immigrants did succeed spectacularly. Andrew Carnegie himself had been an immigrant, arriving from Scotland as a child. His success story became proof that anyone could rise in America, that it truly was the land of opportunity, that hard work and intelligence would be rewarded. But Carnegie's path was exceptional, not typical at all. Most immigrants lived and died in poverty. Their children lived in poverty. Their grandchildren too. The Carnegie story was inspiring, but it was not representative. By 1890, the pattern was firmly established. Waves of immigrants arrived continuously. They took whatever work existed at whatever wages were offered. They lived in crowded, unhealthy conditions. They worked themselves to complete exhaustion. A few rose economically. Most did not. But their labor built the industries that made others fabulously wealthy. Built the railroads. Produced the steel. Refined the oil. Constructed the mansions. Everything. The immigrant contribution to the Gilded Age is often overlooked completely. History books focus on Carnegie's business genius, on Rockefeller's organizational brilliance, on Vanderbilt's monopolistic tactics, on the wealthy men who became famous. But behind every fortune was an army of workers. Their names were never recorded. They received almost nothing for labor that created everything. They suffered and died building wealth for others. The mansions rising on Fifth Avenue required immigrant workers to build them. Stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from Germany. The steel for railroads came from mills worked by immigrants. Polish workers, Hungarian workers. The oil that Rockefeller refined flowed through refineries staffed by immigrants. The wealth displayed so ostentatiously by the rich was extracted from people who could barely survive, who lived one accident away from complete disaster, who had no safety net, no protection, no hope of anything better. This was not unique to America. Industrial revolutions everywhere exploited vulnerable workers. England had done it. Germany was doing it. France too. But America's version had particular characteristics that made it especially harsh. The ethnic diversity and competition. The complete absence of labor protection laws. The ideology that blamed poverty entirely on personal failure rather than systemic exploitation. The belief that wealth proved merit and poverty proved weakness. The immigrants themselves had little choice in any of this. They had come seeking better lives. They found brutal work. But it was work. It was income. However small, they could eat. Most days, they could pay rent. Usually. They sent money to families back home when possible. They endured because endurance was the only option available. And their children, they desperately hoped, would have better chances, better opportunities, better lives. That hope was sometimes fulfilled eventually, but the immediate reality was harsh and unforgiving. The Gilded Age gleamed brilliantly for the few families at the top, for the Vanderbilts and Carnegies and Rockefellers, for the many who built it with their hands and their sweat and often their lives. It was simply survival, one day at a time, one shift at a time, until injury or illness or exhaustion ended their productivity. Then they were discarded, replaced instantly by the next wave of desperate people seeking the American dream. The dream that existed only for a very few, while the many simply struggled to survive. Politics in the Gilded Age was for sale, not secretly, not quietly, openly. Everyone knew it. Everyone accepted it. If you wanted favorable legislation, you bought it. If you needed a charter for your company, you bribed the right officials. If competitors were getting advantages, you purchased better connections. The system was so corrupt that corruption became completely normal, expected, the price of doing business. And the men who operated this system became wealthy in their own right, though nothing compared to the industrialists who funded them. New York's Tammany Hall perfected the political corruption model. It was technically the Democratic Party's organization in Manhattan. But really it was a business. A highly profitable business that happened to involve elections and government operations. William Major Tweed ran Tammany Hall from the late 1860s until 1871. Boss Tweed, as everyone called him, understood a brilliantly simple principle. Control the government, and you can extract money from everyone who needs government services. Contractors wanted city construction contracts. They paid Tweed. Businesses wanted favorable regulations. They paid Tweed. Immigrants wanted citizenship papers. They paid Tweed. The fees were not official. They were bribes. But they were necessary. If you did not pay, you did not get what you needed. It was that simple. The amounts involved were staggering beyond belief. Between 1865 and 1871, Tweed and his close associates stole between $30 and $200 million from New York City. The exact figure was never determined because records were falsified or destroyed. The methods were straightforward and brazen. The city needed a new courthouse. Tweed's allies got the construction contract. They submitted bills inflated by 10 times the actual cost. A plasterer might do 1 day of work and bill for 100 days. Lumber worth $1,000 was invoiced at $50,000. The city paid without question. Tweed and his circle split the excess money. Everyone got rich. Judges were purchased outright. They ruled in favor of whoever compensated them properly. Laws were written specifically to benefit particular companies. Tax assessments were adjusted for the right price. Building inspectors ignored violations if properly rewarded with cash. Police looked away from illegal operations that provided regular protection money. Every single level of government was completely compromised, corrupted, for sale. The immigrant communities that Tammany Hall controlled mostly accepted this arrangement. Yes, the machine was corrupt. Everyone knew that. But it also provided real services that mattered. Jobs for unemployed men. Food baskets for struggling families. Help navigating complicated American bureaucracy. When someone died, Tammany covered the funeral costs. When someone needed a doctor, Tammany sent one. The machine took care of its people even while robbing the city treasury blind. This created loyalty that was not based on ideology or policy. It was purely transactional. Tammany provided concrete immediate benefits. In exchange, immigrants voted for Tammany candidates. Reliably. The machine delivered votes because it delivered benefits first. This was not democracy in any idealistic sense, but it was a system that worked for those involved. Tweed eventually got caught and prosecuted. The New York Times published devastating exposures based on leaked financial records. Cartoonist Thomas Nast drew illustrations showing Tweed as a corrupt boss squeezing the city. Public pressure finally forced prosecution. Tweed was convicted in 1873. He died in prison in 1878. But his fall did not end the corrupt system at all. New bosses simply took over Tammany Hall. The corruption continued, just more carefully. Officials learned to hide their theft better, to falsify records more thoroughly, to spread bribes among more people so no single individual could betray the entire operation. At the federal level, corruption was equally pervasive and accepted. Senators were chosen by state legislatures, not by direct popular election. This made them much easier to influence and control. A wealthy industrialist could compensate enough state legislators to install his chosen candidate in the Senate. Once there, that person would protect the industrialist's interests completely, block unfavorable regulations, support favorable subsidies. The system worked perfectly for the wealthy. Railroad companies were particularly aggressive in buying political influence. They needed federal land grants desperately. They needed favorable regulation. They needed subsidies for construction, so they bought senators and representatives systematically, strategically. Bribes were not even subtle or hidden. Railroad executives kept large amounts of cash in Washington specifically for influencing lawmakers. Everyone knew about it. Nobody stopped it. The credit mobilier scandal showed just how brazen everything had become. The company building the Union Pacific Railroad created a construction firm called Credit Mobilier. The construction firm charged the railroad inflated prices. The excess profit went to insiders who owned both companies. To prevent investigation, they gave free shares to congressmen. Direct bribes. When this became public in 1872, it implicated major political figures. But consequences were minimal. A few men lost elections. Most kept their positions. The system continued operating exactly as before. The spoils system made everything much worse. When a new political party won election, they fired government employees wholesale, replaced them all with political supporters. Every job from postal clerk to customs inspector was awarded based purely on loyalty. You got hired because you supported the winning candidate. You kept your job by continuing that support. Competence was completely irrelevant. Loyalty was everything that mattered. This meant government was incompetent at almost everything. Customs inspectors who did not understand regulations. Tax collectors who could not do basic arithmetic. Postal workers who regularly lost mail. But they had all supported the winning candidate. So they got positions. The cost in efficiency was enormous. But efficiency was never the goal. The goal was rewarding supporters and punishing opponents. Business interests loved this corrupt system deeply. Incompetent regulators were easy to manipulate. Purchased officials stayed bought. The spoils system meant you knew exactly who to approach. They had just been appointed. Everything was predictable and controllable. You knew the cost of favorable treatment. You made the payment. You got what you wanted, simple, efficient, reliable. Reformers tried fighting back against all this corruption. They called for civil service reform, for hiring government employees based on merit and competence, not political loyalty, for ending the spoils system completely, for regulating railroads fairly, for breaking up monopolies. But they faced enormous opposition from every direction. The industrialists opposed reform because it threatened their advantages. Officials opposed it because corruption was personally profitable. Even immigrant communities often opposed reform because political machines provided services that reformers did not. Some states passed Granger laws in the 1870s attempting regulation. These laws regulated railroad rates, prevented price discrimination. But railroads fought back viciously in courts. They argued regulation violated their property rights. They won often enough to make the laws mostly ineffective. Federal regulation would not come until much later. The railroads successfully delayed it for decades. The Supreme Court in this era consistently sided with business interests. Judges interpreted the Constitution to protect corporate property rights above everything else. They struck down laws limiting working hours. They invalidated price regulations. They protected trusts from antitrust prosecution. The judiciary became another massive barrier preventing any reform. All of this created an environment where men like Carnegie and Rockefeller could operate with complete freedom. They compensated lawmakers for favorable treatment. They influenced judges to rule in their favor. They funded friendly journalists to write positive articles. They hired strikebreakers to crush unions violently. Everything was for sale. This was not subtle conspiracy. It was open standard practice. By 1893, the corrupt system seemed permanent and invincible. Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition that year. 400 acres along Lake Michigan transformed into the White City. Gleaming white buildings designed to look like ancient Rome. 27 million people visited over 6 months. It was America showing the world what it had become: powerful, modern, rich, successful. The exposition celebrated 400 years since Columbus reached America. But really, it celebrated American industrial power. The exhibits showcased everything: steel production, railroad systems, electrical lighting, manufacturing prowess. Everything that had made Gilded Age fortunes possible was on proud display. The White City itself was a marvel of engineering. Grand buildings arranged around lagoons. Everything painted brilliant white. At night, electric lights illuminated the entire complex. Most Americans had never seen electric lighting on such massive scale. It was literally dazzling. George Ferris built the first Ferris wheel specifically for this exposition. 264 feet tall, carrying over 2,000 passengers at once. It was pure engineering spectacle, a demonstration that American ingenuity could create absolutely anything. Visitors lined up for hours to ride it. The wealthy attended in large numbers from New York and Boston and Philadelphia. They toured the exhibits. They attended elaborate receptions. They saw American industrial might displayed proudly. For them, the exposition validated everything they had built. But the timing was darkly ironic. While Chicago celebrated, economic trouble was building again. Another panic started in May 1893. Just as the exposition opened, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. Within weeks, other railroads followed. Banks began failing. The stock market crashed again. By summer, the country was entering another severe depression. Visitors to the White City returned home to find banks closed and jobs disappearing. The contrast was stark and disturbing. This depression lasted 4 brutal years. It showed that despite all the wealth concentrated at the top, the American economy remained fundamentally fragile. The exposition closed in October. The White City was dismantled. The buildings were temporary, designed to last only for the exhibition. Within months, most were completely gone. The whole spectacular display vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. But something important had happened during the Gilded Age. Something that would define America for generations. The system had not evolved naturally. It had been deliberately created. The lack of regulations was not accident. It was policy. The corruption was not an unfortunate side effect. It was how the system functioned by design. The extreme inequality was not unintended consequence. It was the goal. Think about what had happened since 1865. The Civil War ended. The Transcontinental Railroad connected the coasts. Vanderbilt showed how to build monopolies. The 1873 panic let the strong destroy the weak. Carnegie and Rockefeller perfected industrial control. Millions of immigrants provided desperate cheap labor. Political corruption protected everything. Each step was deliberate. Each decision was intentional. Each policy was chosen. Men in power had looked at post-war America and made specific choices. They chose not to regulate monopolies. They chose not to protect workers. They chose not to limit working hours. They chose not to prevent child labor. They chose not to tax wealth. They chose not to prosecute corruption. These were not oversights. These were decisions. Conscious, deliberate decisions. The result was exactly what those decisions were designed to create. Extreme concentration of wealth. A few dozen families controlling most of the American economy. Workers with almost nothing. Immigrants exploited brutally. Children working in factories. Political systems completely corrupted. Democracy that existed in name only. Oligarchy in practice. The wealthy had won completely. They controlled industries. They controlled politics. They controlled courts. They controlled media. They had built a system that transferred wealth upward constantly. That protected their fortunes from redistribution. That prevented workers from organizing. That made opposition nearly impossible. The machine ran itself now. No one needed to actively maintain it anymore. But cracks were forming even at the peak. Labor unrest was increasing. Strikes were becoming larger and more violent. Muckraking journalists were beginning investigations that would expose everything. Progressive politicians were building coalitions. Public anger was rising slowly. The system that seemed invincible in 1893 would start crumbling within 2 decades. Income taxes would eventually be imposed. Antitrust laws would break up monopolies. Labor would organize successfully. Regulations would constrain business. The Gilded Age would end. But it had lasted over 30 years. 1 generation. Long enough to create fortunes that would last for centuries. Long enough to reshape America fundamentally. Long enough to prove that extreme inequality was possible. That a few men could capture almost everything. This was the dark story of how America created the Gilded Age. Not through natural evolution. Not through inevitable progress. But through specific deliberate choices. To eliminate protections. To allow monopolies. To permit exploitation. To accept corruption. The men who made those choices became the wealthiest in history. The people who suffered from those choices were forgotten. Their names lost, their sacrifices ignored. But they built everything. The railroads, the steel, the oil, the mansions, everything. And they received almost nothing in return. That was the foundation. That was the truth. That was how the Gilded Age was really created.